The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that stopped being maintained by the county 11 years ago, which was, coincidentally, the same number of years Rowan Voss had lived inside it. Morning arrived the way it always did, not as light, because light meant nothing to him anymore, but as temperature, a shift of 2 degrees against his left cheek, where the window let in the first heat of the sun. He knew it was 6:14 without checking the talking clock on the nightstand, because his body had replaced the sun with its own clock, one built from 11 years of doing the exact same thing in the exact same order, every single day, until the order itself became a kind of sight. He rose. He did not fumble. His hand found the edge of the dresser, exactly 9 inches from the bed frame, because it was always 9 inches from the bed frame, because he had measured it once with a tape measure and never allowed it to move again. 3 drawers. The second one held socks, folded in matching pairs, arranged by texture rather than color, because color had stopped being useful to him around the same time his left eye stopped registering anything but a gray wash of almost light, and his right eye stopped registering anything at all. The kitchen took 40 exactly measured steps from the bedroom door. Rowan counted them without meaning to, the way another man might hum. Coffee, 1 scoop, the same red tin can with a notch filed into the lid so he'd know it apart from the tin of oatmeal beside it. Water to the second line etched into the metal cup with a screwdriver tip. Years ago, back when his hands had still shaken constantly instead of only sometimes. It was during the pouring, the water arcing down into the kettle with a sound like rain starting on a tin roof, that his left hand did the thing it always did. It curled, slowly, and then all at once, the fingers folding inward toward the palm until the knuckles went hard and pale, the tendons standing up along the back of his hand like roots pushing through dry soil. He did not notice himself doing it. He never did. It was only after, when the kettle was on the burner and his hand ached in that particular deep way that meant it had been clenched for longer than a few seconds, that he'd uncurl it, finger by finger, and rub his thumb across the calloused ridge that ran along his palm, a ridge shaped, if anyone had ever cared to look closely, exactly like where a leather lead might sit, worn in over years of gripping it in rain, in heat, in the 4 seconds before a door got kicked in. Nobody had cared to look closely in a long time. That was, more or less, the entire architecture of his life now, a structure built so nothing would ever require him to be seen. He ate oatmeal standing at the counter, facing the window out of habit rather than purpose, and the silence around him wasn't the silence of an empty house. It was thicker than that. It had a weight to it, the kind of quiet that presses against the eardrums of a man whose hearing had also been taken, partially, unevenly, so that some sounds arrived to him full, and others arrived as fragments, half words, half notes, as if the world spoke to him, now only in pieces of a language he used to know completely. He did not think of himself as lonely. Lonely was a word for men who remembered what company felt like and missed it. Rowan had simply stopped keeping company with the part of himself that used to want things, used to want a dog patting at his heel, used to want a voice other than his own filling up a room. That man had died somewhere between a rooftop in a country he no longer said the name of out loud, and a hospital bed where he woke up to a doctor telling him, very gently, that the damage was permanent. The oatmeal went cold in the bowl. His hand, without his permission, began to curl again. But what the dog did next shocked everyone. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe to Kindness and K9 Legends. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. It was the smell that stopped him first. 3 days later, halfway across the yard on his way to check the rain barrel by touch and habit. Copper. Faint, but unmistakable to a man who had spent 2 decades learning exactly what blood smelled like at every stage of drying. Fresh and metallic, then sweetish and thick, then finally the flat mineral stink of old blood, gone dark on soil. This was somewhere in the middle, recent enough to still carry an edge. Rowan stopped walking. He turned his head the way he always did now. Not toward things, but toward sound and scent, angling his good ear, what remained of good, into the wind. The smell was coming from the direction of the tool shed, a leaning structure 15 paces from the cabin's east wall, that he used mostly for storage and hadn't opened in a week. He crossed the distance slowly, his cane tapping ahead of him in short economical arcs, counting the ground the way he counted everything. At the shed door he paused, listened. Beneath the ordinary sounds, wind combing through the tree line, a woodpecker working somewhere off to the north, there was something else. A sound low enough that most people would have missed it entirely. A sound that lived underneath other sounds. Breathing. Ragged and wrong. Too fast, too shallow, with a catch in it every third or fourth breath. The kind of catch that meant something inside was hurting with every inhale. He crouched at the doorway rather than stepping through it, lowering his weight slow and deliberate, the way he'd been trained to lower himself into rooms that might not want him in them. "Hey," he said, quiet, to nothing he could see. "I hear you." The breathing stopped. Then came the sound underneath the sound, a growl, but not the growl of an animal announcing itself. This was smaller than that, tighter, choked down at the back of a throat, like something being held on a leash too short, even for the animal wearing it. It cracked in the middle, the vocal cords catching on something that might have been pain and might have been an old and permanent kind of fear, and it did not rise. It stayed low, a single sustained note of warning, aimed at a threat that hadn't yet proven itself to be one. Rowan did not move closer. He had learned, in another life, in another kind of darkness, that the worst thing you could do to something cornered was crowd it. He lowered himself the rest of the way, to sit cross-legged in the shed's doorway, 6 feet back from wherever the sound was coming from, and let his hands rest open and visible on his knees, a gesture that meant nothing to him visually anymore, but everything to him as instinct, the same instinct that told a man to keep his palms up in a room full of people deciding whether to trust him. From the dark corner behind a stack of paint cans, he heard the scrape of claws dragging half an inch across the wooden floor, not toward him, not away, just a shift of weight, a repositioning. And beneath that, so faint he almost missed it, a wet, uneven sound of something breathing through pain along its left side, a rhythm broken every few seconds by a catch, a hitch, the unmistakable stutter of a body protecting a wound it couldn't afford to move. He couldn't see the scar. He would never see the scar. Not the raised, jagged line of old damage cutting 6 inches along a rib cage the color of dark sable. Not the way the fur around it grew in wrong, thinner, paler, refusing ever again to lie flat the way the rest of the coat did. But he could hear everything the wound was costing. "Okay," Rowan said softly, to the growling dark. "Okay, I'm not going anywhere." He did not go back inside that night. He told himself it was because leaving now would mean the animal spent another night alone, with whatever was hollowing it out from the inside. But the truth, if he'd let himself look at it, was closer to recognition. Something in the ragged rhythm of that breathing matched a rhythm he knew from the inside of his own chest, on the nights the room got too small and his hand wouldn't stop closing around nothing. He brought a blanket from the cabin, folded it into a loose square, and set it down at the threshold of the shed, not thrown, not tossed, but placed with the same deliberate care he used for everything now, a motion designed to make its sound entirely predictable, fabric settling on wood, nothing sudden. From the dark, the growl dropped half a register, not gone, but recalculating. He talked, not to soothe. He'd never been much good at soothing, hadn't had reason to practice it in over a decade, but because a moving voice was a mapped voice, and a mapped voice was a known thing, and known things got growled at less than silence did. He talked about the weather, about the rain barrel he'd been walking toward before the smell had turned him, about nothing that mattered, in a register pitched low and level, the same flat, undramatic tone he used to use over a radio when the situation on the other end was already bad enough, without his voice adding to it. 20 minutes in, his elbow caught the old dog leash hook still screwed into the shed's doorframe, a leftover from some structure's previous life, a curved piece of iron with a small clasp swinging loose on it, and it knocked once, lightly, against the metal latch beside it. A short, bright clink, gone almost as soon as it sounded. The reaction was immediate and total. The growling stopped. In its place came something worse than growling. The frantic scrabble of claws against wood, a full-body scramble backward that ended in a solid, ugly thud of something colliding with the shed's back wall, and then silence so complete and so sudden that Rowan felt it more than heard it. A silence with a shape, the specific hollow quality of breath being held by something too frightened to make a sound at all. He sat very still. He did not repeat the motion. He did not ask what that had meant, though some old, still functioning part of his mind was already assembling an answer he didn't like. A leash, a choke chain, a crate latch, maybe, or a chain-link kennel door, some particular clink of two metal pieces meeting that had, at some point, arrived immediately before something far worse. "That's on me," he said quietly, into the new and heavier dark. "Won't happen again." He meant it as more than an apology for a single accidental noise, though he couldn't have said, in that moment, what else he meant it as. He stayed another hour, saying nothing important, letting his voice do the only work it could do, which was simply continue. Proof of a presence that made no further threatening sounds, that did not move closer, that did not reach. Somewhere past the 9th or 10th minute of silence following the clink, the breathing in the dark corner began to even out again, degree by degree, the way a held note eventually has to resolve. It never returned to normal, he suspected, listening to the particular tightness that stayed wound through every third breath, that it might not have been normal in a very long time. When he finally rose to go back inside, joints protesting, his left hand curled once, hard, fingers biting into his palm along that same worn ridge, and he didn't uncurl it until he was back at his own kitchen table, in his own particular quiet, sitting across from an empty chair that had, for exactly 1 hour, felt less empty than it had in years. The first week, Rowan left food at the threshold and retreated to the porch steps, close enough to be present, far enough to not be a threat, a distance he calculated the way he calculated everything now, by increments of sound rather than sight. He'd set the bowl down, back away 12 paces exactly, and sit with his hands open on his knees until the sound of tentative eating reached him. Quick, wary bites, pauses between each one, long enough to suggest a head lifting, checking, before dropping again. By the second week, he'd learned to tell a great deal from very little. He learned that 4 bites came before every pause, and that the pause lasted exactly as long as it took him to shift his weight on the step, as if the animal in the shed was testing whether his own stillness could be trusted to hold. He learned the specific rhythm of paws crossing the shed's wooden floor, a hitch on the third step that told him which leg still ached, and how that hitch grew fractionally smaller day by day, evidence of healing that no eye needed to confirm. He never called the dog anything at first. Names were claims, and claims required a kind of certainty he didn't feel he'd earned. He simply began speaking before every approach, a low, even "coming up now," before he set the bowl down, the same 3 words in the same order every time, until the words themselves became a kind of leash, a thing the dog could hold on to even when the hands attached to the voice stayed 12 paces back. The 3rd week brought the first real change. He'd set the bowl down, said his 3 words, and turned to go. And instead of the usual silence stretching out behind him, he heard something new, the click of nails on wood, not retreating deeper into the shed as they always had, but advancing, slow and uneven, toward the doorway itself. He stopped walking. He did not turn around. Turning around meant a face, a direct gaze, and even blind, even sightless, some old animal instinct told him that facing an animal head-on was still a kind of pressure, a kind of claim. He simply stood, profile angled toward the sound, and waited. The dog came to the threshold and stopped there, and Rowan heard, for the first time, clean and unmistakable, the specific texture of its breath at close range. Not the ragged panic breath of the first night. Something steadier now, though still carrying that faint catch on the inhale, a permanent stutter stitched into the rhythm the way his own hand carried its permanent curl. He began to name the sounds instead of the dog, the low huff that meant wariness, a different huff, shorter and sharper, that meant something closer to curiosity, a thin whine, almost inaudible, that came only when Rowan's own hand betrayed him and curled without his permission, as though the animal had learned to read that specific silence, the change in his breathing that came with it, faster than any person ever had. It was during the 5th week, on an evening thick with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen, that Rowan caught something else on the air and went very still. Cigarette smoke, but not just any cigarette smoke. A particular blend, cheap tobacco cut with something faintly clove sweet, the kind sold in a specific yellow and red pack he hadn't smelled in years, carried faint and far off on a shift of wind from the direction of the county road. It was gone as quickly as it came, dissolved back into pine and wet earth, and Rowan might have thought nothing of it at all, except for what happened at his feet. The dog, who had by then taken to lying just inside the shed doorway during these evening visits, close enough now that Rowan could hear individual breaths, went rigid. The huffing stopped. The tail, Rowan couldn't see it, but he heard the distinct absence of its usual soft thump against the doorframe, simply stopped moving. A low sound built in the dog's chest. Not the old defensive growl exactly, but something closer to dread. A sound with none of the challenge in it that fear usually carried. Only the flat certainty of something remembered and hated. "Hey," Rowan said quietly, turning his head toward the sound of that stilled breathing. "You're all right. Whatever that was, it's not here." The growl didn't stop right away, but the dog didn't retreat either. And later, replaying it in the dark of his own kitchen, Rowan understood that as its own kind of trust, the choice to stay rigid beside him, rather than run, when running had clearly, at some point, been the only thing that had ever kept it safe. By the end of the 6th week, the dog ate from a bowl set an arm's length away, rather than 12 paces off. By the 7th, it had a name, Dagger, chosen not for menace, but for the shape Rowan's fingers found once, tracing with permission along a raised line of scar tissue on the left side, a name for a wound shaped like a blade and worn like a badge. And by then, though neither of them marked the exact night it happened, Dagger had stopped sleeping in the shed at all and had taken instead to lying just inside the cabin door, close enough that Rowan, lying awake in the dark the way he often did, could hear every breath and match it, without meaning to the rhythm of his own. It was a Tuesday, though Rowan only knew that because Dagger's schedule of small habits, a stretch against the porch rail, a specific circuit of the yard's perimeter, always ran 15 minutes longer on Tuesdays, for reasons Rowan had never determined and had long since stopped questioning. He was on the porch step, coffee cooling in his hand, when Dagger's whole body went still beside him, not the rigid, dread-soaked stillness of the cigarette smoke weeks before. This was different, ears forward. Rowan guessed from the shift of fur he felt brush his forearm, a low huff of alertness rather than fear. Then, underneath the wind, Rowan heard it too, an engine, but wrong, a cough and sputter, a rhythm with a hole in it, growing louder in fits along the gravel road that led nowhere except to his cabin and, eventually, to nothing at all. The car died completely about 30 yards out. He heard the final shudder of it, then a door, not slammed, but pulled shut with the particular over-careful quiet of someone trying very hard not to announce themselves, and then footsteps, light and quick, an adult stride, and beneath it, half a beat behind, the shorter, uneven double step of a child working to keep pace. Dagger's low huff sharpened into something else, not aggression. Rowan had learned the difference by now. This was closer to the sound the dog made when a shape approached that hadn't yet been sorted into safe or unsafe, a held note of judgment reserved. "Hello!" The voice reached the porch before its owner did. A woman's voice, pitched carefully even, the kind of even that took real effort to hold. "I'm sorry. I saw the cabin from the road. I didn't mean to just... My car just died, and I don't have any signal out here, and..." She stopped. Rowan understood why a half-second later, when he heard the smaller set of footsteps stumble to a halt just behind her, followed by the particular unmistakable hitch of a child's breath, trying not to turn into crying. He knew that sound. He'd made it himself, once, in a hospital hallway, trying to hold a shape that kept threatening to come apart. "You're not bothering anyone," Rowan said, keeping his voice at the same low, flat register he used with Dagger, the register that made no claims and asked for none. "There's a chair on the porch if you want it. Water inside if you need it." A pause. He could feel her looking at him, at the cane resting against his knee, at eyes that tracked toward her voice rather than her face, doing the fast recalculation people always did when they realized who they were talking to. "I don't want to intrude," she said. "We can just wait for..." "It's a 40-minute walk to anything with a signal," Rowan said. "You're not intruding. Sit." He heard her weight settle onto the porch step, and the boys a beat later, closer to her than to Rowan, close enough that Rowan could hear his breathing. Fast, shallow, the particular fast shallow that wasn't about a broken-down car at all. Children didn't breathe like that over car trouble. They breathed like that over things that had teeth. Dagger, who had not moved from Rowan's side, let out a single low sound. Not a growl, not quite a greeting. Something suspended between the two, and Rowan felt the shift of weight as the dog lowered himself onto the porch boards, positioned, without needing to be told, at an angle that put his body loosely between the strangers and the yard beyond. The woman noticed. Rowan heard the small catch in her breath. He won't hurt anyone who isn't already trying to," Rowan said. You look like you're trying not to be found, not trying to hurt anybody." The silence that followed had a different texture than any silence Rowan had grown used to in that cabin. Not the flat, familiar quiet of a life built around absence, but a taut, listening quiet. The kind that came from two people deciding, in real time, whether the safest thing they'd stumbled onto in a long while might actually be safe. "My name's Mara," she said finally. "This is Eli." A beat. We weren't exactly headed anywhere. We were headed away from somewhere. Beside him, Dagger's ears. Rowan could feel it in the subtle shift of the dog's head. Turned toward the boy's still uneven breathing, and stayed there. Rowan made coffee for 3, working the kitchen by feel, while Mara sat at the table and Eli stayed close to Dagger on the porch. The two of them arranged in a silence that seemed, from the sounds of it, more comfortable than the one Rowan was about to walk into. He set a mug in front of where he judged Mara's hands to be, and heard her wrap both palms around it without drinking, the universal gesture of someone holding on to warmth, because it was easier than holding on to anything else. "You don't have to tell me," Rowan said, settling into the chair across from her. "But you also drove 40 minutes down a dead-end road in a car that was already dying. That's not a wrong turn. That's a last option." He heard her exhale, long, and a little unsteady at the end. "It's my grandfather's land," she said. "Was. 6 acres, out past Colton Ridge. He left it to me when he passed. Free and clear. No liens, nothing. I checked. Back then, I checked everything. And now? Now there's a lien." Her voice tightened on the word, like she'd said it so many times it had worn a groove into her throat. "Filed 8 months ago. Says my grandfather took out a loan against the property 3 years before he died, $41,000, and never paid it back. Except he didn't. I have his bank statements. I have every check he ever wrote, going back a decade, because he never trusted anything he couldn't hold in his hand. There's no loan. There's no $41,000. There's just a piece of paper with his signature on it. That isn't his signature." Rowan sat very still, the way he did when he wanted a voice to keep talking without interruption. "Who filed it?" "A company. Ridgeline Holdings. I called the number on the paperwork 4 times. Got a recording twice, and twice I got a man who told me the debt was legitimate and I had until the end of the month to pay it in full or vacate." A pause, and when she continued, something harder had entered her voice, something that had clearly been sharpened by months of running into the same wall. "I went to the county sheriff's office. I brought the bank statements. I brought a handwriting comparison I paid for myself. $40 I didn't have, from a man in town who does that for court cases. And the deputy who took my file, he barely looked at any of it. Told me forged signatures were a civil matter, not a criminal one. And civil matters took time, and in the meantime the lien stood." Her cup made a small sound against the table, set down harder than she'd meant to. "The end of the month is in 11 days. You have somewhere to go after." "No." The word came out flat, unadorned. The kind of no that had already run through every alternative and found none of them standing. "That land is the only thing that's ever been ours outright. No landlord, no lease, nothing anyone could take with a piece of paper. Except, apparently, that's exactly what someone's doing." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she caught it, visibly, the way Rowan had learned to hear people catch things. A held breath, a swallow, the sound of someone refusing to let a stranger watch them fall apart, even when the stranger in question couldn't see them do it anyway. Rowan didn't offer comfort. He'd never been good at comfort, and something in him suspected Mara didn't want it. That comfort, right now, would feel like being handled instead of heard. So instead, he asked the only question that mattered. This deputy, who wouldn't look at your file. "You get a name?" She hesitated, and he heard the hesitation clearly, the small pull of someone deciding whether a stranger with a cane and a scarred dog on his porch was worth the risk of an answer. "Ashby," she said finally. "Deputy Ashby, Grant Ashby." Out on the porch, faint through the open window, Rowan heard Dagger's low huff shift into something else entirely. A sound he hadn't heard since the night of the cigarette smoke. A sound with dread folded into its edges, and Rowan went very still, filing the name away next to a clink of metal and a particular sweet clove smell on the wind. 3 separate threads that had just, without warning, brushed against the same cold place. He said nothing about it yet. He only said, quiet and level, 11 days is enough time. Tell me everything you've got. Mara and Eli stayed in the cabin's second room that night, a room that had held nothing but boxes for 11 years, cleared out in 20 silent minutes, while Mara insisted she could sleep in the car, and Rowan simply kept moving boxes until there was nowhere left for the argument to live. By the time the house went quiet, Dagger had taken up a position at the base of the stairs, not lying down, sitting, ears working at every settle and creak the old cabin made in the dark. Rowan didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with his old phone, the one with the raised buttons and the voice that read numbers back to him, and began doing the only thing he still knew how to do with any real precision, building a picture out of fragments, the way he'd been trained to build one out of radio static and half-heard chatter, back when a picture assembled wrong could cost more than a piece of land. The first call went to a number he hadn't dialed in 3 years. It rang 4 times before a voice picked up, gravel rough with sleep, and instantly, entirely awake the moment it registered who was calling. "Voss, it's been a while. Denny." Rowan kept his voice level, the old economy of words returning to him like a muscle memory. "I need a favor. Public records. County land office. Out past a place called Colton Ridge. I need to know who's behind a company called Ridgeline Holdings. And I need to know it fast." Denny Ruiz had been a combat medic once, patched Rowan back together more than once, in places neither of them talked about anymore, and had since become the kind of investigator who did quiet, careful work for a state attorney's office 2 counties over, the kind of work that involved knowing exactly which records were public and which ones merely pretended to be locked. "Give me a day," Denny said. "Maybe 2. Ridgeline mean anything to you specifically? Or is this a stranger's problem?" "Family that landed on my porch," Rowan said. "It's mine now." He made 3 more calls before the sky outside began to lighten by the temperature change against his skin. A retired JAG officer who owed him nothing but answered anyway. A county records clerk in a neighboring township, softened by a decade-old kindness Rowan barely remembered performing. Each call added 1 more piece, a filing date, a registered agent's name that dissolved the moment anyone tried to find the person behind it, a pattern of similar liens filed against similarly isolated, similarly elderly landowners, going back at least 4 years, each one just under the radius that might have triggered any real investigation, each one settled quietly, quickly, by people too tired or too frightened to fight. By late morning, Denny called back, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man who has found something he doesn't like. Ridgeline's registered agent traces to a P.O. box, that traces to a name, that traces to a guy who used to work county law enforcement before he didn't. Grant Ashby left the sheriff's department 8 years back, under circumstances nobody wrote down clearly, which usually means somebody wanted it that way. Rowan's left hand, resting flat on the table, began to curl. It was around that same hour that Dagger's behavior changed. Rowan noticed it first as a shift in the dog's breathing near the front window. Quick, alert breaths, a low, continuous rumble building in his chest. And then, as the unmistakable click of claws crossing hardwood at a speed Rowan hadn't heard from him in weeks. Outside, faint, an engine passed on the county road, slowing briefly as it neared the turnoff before continuing on. An ordinary sound. A car on a road. But Dagger stayed at the window long after the engine faded, a low, continuous growl vibrating out of him. And it happened again 2 hours later with a different engine. And again that evening. Not every car, Rowan began to realize, listening carefully across each occurrence, but certain ones that slowed in a particular way at the turnoff, as if checking, as if counting days. "He's not wrong about much," Rowan said quietly to Mara that evening, his hand resting on Dagger's rigid shoulders, feeling the low thrum of the growl beneath his palm. "Somebody's watching this road." The knock came on the 9th day, in the flat gray hour just after noon. 3 deliberate raps that carried none of the hesitance Mara's knock had carried on the day she'd arrived. This was a knock that expected to be answered. Dagger was on his feet before the 3rd rap finished landing. Not the alert stiffness of the passing cars on the county road. This was total, immediate, every muscle in his body locking into place at once, and Rowan, standing from the kitchen table, felt the change in the air before he understood its source. The low, continuous growl building in Dagger's chest wasn't building at all. It was already there, fully formed, arrived whole the way dread arrives in a person who recognizes a shape before their mind can name it. "Sheriff's Department," a voice called through the door. Male, unhurried, pitched with the particular flat authority of a man used to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. "Looking for a Mara Kessler. Got her vehicle registered out this way." Rowan crossed to the door with his cane tapping ahead of him, and it was in the 3 steps it took to reach the handle that the pieces he'd been carrying separately for weeks. A clink of metal against metal in a dark shed, a thread of clove-sweet cigarette smoke on an evening wind, a dread-soaked stillness that had no obvious cause, arranged themselves, unbidden, into a single shape. He opened the door, and the smell reached him a half-second before the voice did. Clove-sweet tobacco, cheap and specific, worn into the fabric of a uniform, the way certain smells work themselves permanently into cloth. And beneath it, a fainter note, metal. The particular cold iron smell of a set of handcuffs riding at a belt, swinging faintly with each shift of weight, clinking once, softly, against something else on that belt as the man before him settled his stance. Behind Rowan, Dagger made a sound Rowan had never heard him make before. Not a growl at all, but something closer to a whine, choked halfway into a snarl. An animal sound with something almost human buried underneath it, panic and hatred braided together so tightly neither one could be pulled free of the other. Rowan heard him scramble backward across the floorboards, claws skidding, a full retreat that ended somewhere near the kitchen table, followed by a silence worse than any sound. The held-breath stillness of something that had learned, once, brutally, that running only ever bought a little time. "Deputy Ashby," the man on the porch said, and Rowan felt something cold settle into place at the base of his spine, because he recognized the voice now too, the same even, unhurried register Mara had described across her kitchen table, the voice of a man who took his time because he had never once been made to answer for it. "Mind if I come in and have a word?" "She's not available," Rowan said, keeping his own voice level, planting his weight in the doorway, in a way that made the answer not a suggestion. "This land's posted. You've got a warrant. I'll hear about it. Otherwise, we're done here." A pause. Rowan could hear Ashby recalibrating. The small shift of a man unused to a door, not simply opening for him. "That's an interesting dog you got scrambling around in there," Ashby said, and something in his tone had changed, gone almost idle, almost amused, in a way that made the hair rise on Rowan's own arms before he understood why. Belgian Malinois, that growl, had one of those, myself, years back. Washout from a K9 program. Didn't take to correction real well. A short, dry huff of a laugh. Some dogs just aren't built for the work. You gotta be firm with them, or they never learn. Behind him, Dagger's whine broke into something raw and cracked. A sound Rowan felt more than heard through the floorboards. And every piece Rowan had gathered over the past weeks. The shed, the scar along the ribs, the flinch at a clink of metal, the collapse of trust at a thread of clove smoke on the wind, assembled itself into a single, unbearable certainty. This was not a coincidence of scent and sound. This was the specific voice, the specific hand, that had put a permanent stutter into a good dog's breathing and a permanent scar 6 inches long into his side. Rowan's left hand, hanging at his own side, closed slowly into a fist. Not the old unconscious curl this time, but something deliberate, something chosen, the fingers folding shut around a fury he had not let himself feel in 11 years. "You should go," Rowan said, and his voice did not rise, did not shake, stayed low and level and utterly, dangerously calm. "Before I stop being polite about it." Ashby's weight shifted on the porch boards. Considering, Rowan judged, whether the blind man in the doorway was worth the trouble today, or whether patience would serve him better. 11 days becomes 10 tomorrow, Ashby said finally, and Rowan heard the smile in it, the casual cruelty of a man who had never once had to hurry. "Tell your friend that." Footsteps retreated across the porch, unhurried, the clink of metal at his belt fading with each step, until an engine turned over somewhere down the gravel road and pulled away. Rowan stood in the doorway a long moment after the sound had gone, and then turned back into the house, toward the low, wounded sound, still coming from beneath the kitchen table, and said the only thing he had left to offer. "It's over. He's gone, and he is never getting near you again." Ashby came back on the 11th day, exactly as promised, and this time he did not come alone. Rowan heard 2 vehicles turn off the county road, the deputy's cruiser, and behind it, a second engine, heavier, idling with the particular patience of something towing. A tow truck. Rowan understood, in the space of that single sound, exactly what kind of afternoon this was meant to be. He was already on the porch when the doors opened. He had been there since morning, sitting in the same chair, Dagger lying pressed along his left side, not hidden this time, not retreated beneath a table, but present, visible, his body between Rowan's chair and the porch steps, still as carved stone. "This doesn't have to get complicated," Ashby called out, boots striking gravel with unhurried confidence. "Lien's valid. Paperwork's filed. Deadlines passed as of midnight. I've got a court order for the tow, and I've got a truck that can take the vehicle now or take it in an hour. Doesn't matter to me either way." "Funny thing about deadlines," Rowan said, not rising from his chair. "They tend to matter less when the paperwork behind them is fraudulent." A pause, brief, and Rowan heard it clearly. The small recalibration of a man who had expected resistance, shaped like fear, and was instead getting something shaped like certainty. That's a serious accusation for a man who can't read the paperwork himself. "I don't need to read it," Rowan said. "I've got people who already have." He raised 2 fingers, unhurried, and behind him, the porch door opened. Denny Ruiz stepped out first, a manila folder under one arm, his voice carrying the flat, procedural calm of a man who had spent a career making sure his calm outlasted everyone else's temper. "State Attorney's Office, Financial Crimes Division," Denny said. "Grant Ashby. I've got a handwriting analysis on the loan document filed against this property, matched against 6 other liens filed by Ridgeline Holdings over the past 4 years. Every one of them showing the same forged signature pattern. Every one of them filed against elderly or isolated landowners within 18 months of losing a spouse or a caretaker. I've also got banking records showing the P.O. box tied to Ridgeline routes payments to an account opened under your late mother's maiden name." He let that settle before adding, evenly, "I've been building this file for 6 weeks. Today just moved the timeline up." Behind Denny came a second figure, older, sharper-voiced, introducing herself as a state inspector from the Land Fraud Division, a woman Denny had contacted 3 days prior, the moment the pattern in the county records had become undeniable. She held up a folder of her own. "We've already got a judge's signature on a stay against this lien, filed this morning," she said. "Which means, Deputy, that tow truck behind you is about to leave with nothing on it." Ashby didn't move for a long moment. Rowan, listening, could hear the recalculation happening in real time. The shift of weight from one foot to the other, the exhale through the nose that men made when a room had stopped bending to them. "This is a mistake," Ashby said finally, and the easy authority had drained out of his voice, replaced by something thinner, something with an edge of panic starting to show through. "You're going to want to think real carefully about who you're—" "I have thought about it," Rowan said, and for the first time since Ashby's boots had hit the gravel, he stood. Dagger rose with him, unhurried, unbothered, taking one single step forward to plant himself squarely between Rowan and the steps. Not lunging, not barking, not baring a single tooth, just present. A wall of stillness, where a threat was supposed to be. "You put a scar on that dog that never fully healed. You've spent years putting your name on other people's land and calling it paperwork. And the only reason any of that worked for as long as it did is because you counted on nobody looking closely enough or caring enough to put it together." His voice did not rise. It never once rose. "I looked. I cared. And I am not the only one anymore." The silence that followed had weight to it, not the empty silence of Rowan's old cabin mornings, but something dense and total, the particular quiet of a man realizing, all at once, that every door he'd counted on had already quietly closed behind him. Somewhere behind Ashby, the tow truck's engine cut off. A radio crackled faintly from the inspector's belt, confirming a second cruiser already inbound. Ashby's hand drifted, briefly, toward his belt, and stopped, entirely, at the sound that rose up from Dagger's chest. Not a growl this time, something lower than that, something with no warning left in it at all, a sound that had traded fear for something closer to resolve. "Get in your car, Grant," the inspector said quietly. "This conversation continues downtown." He went. Not quickly, not with any grace, but he went, down the porch steps, past the silent tow truck, into his cruiser, the engine turning over and pulling away down the gravel road for what both Rowan and Dagger understood, without needing a single word between them, to be the last time. No one on that porch had thrown a single punch. Rowan hadn't needed to lift a hand. The only weapon that had mattered all along had been the quiet, patient work of 11 days, and the dog standing utterly still at his side, who had not attacked, had not needed to, had simply refused, this time, to be afraid. The sound of Ashby's cruiser faded past the tree line, and for a long moment nobody on the porch moved. Denny closed his folder with a soft, final sound, The inspector spoke quietly into her radio, confirming details Rowan only half registered. His attention narrowed entirely to the dog still standing rigid against his leg. Dagger hadn't moved from his position at the top of the steps. His body remained locked in that same forward-leaning stillness, weight braced, and Rowan, reaching down, slow and telegraphed the way he always reached toward him, felt the tremor before he felt anything else. A fine, constant shiver running the length of Dagger's frame, muscle to muscle, the kind of shaking that had nothing to do with cold. "Hey," Rowan said softly, crouching now, ignoring the ache it put in his knees. "Hey, it's done. He's gone." The shiver didn't stop right away. It rarely did. Rowan had learned over these past weeks. Fear left a body on its own schedule, not according to when the danger actually ended. He kept his hand resting lightly against Dagger's shoulder, not gripping, not pulling him anywhere, just present. The way he'd learned presence was the only offering that ever mattered to an animal who'd spent years learning that hands meant something to brace against. It was Eli's voice that broke through first, small, from the doorway where he and Mara had been watching. "Is he okay?" "He will be," Rowan said, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he believed it. Slowly, in stages, the shiver began to ease. Dagger's weight shifted, the forward-braced stance softening by degrees, until finally, a long minute later, maybe two, he sat. Not collapsed, not defeated, but sat, deliberately, the way a soldier might finally lower a weapon once a room had been cleared and confirmed. He leaned then, the full weight of his shoulder coming to rest against Rowan's side, a pressure Rowan had felt only in small, testing increments before now. Never like this, never total, never given without reservation. Rowan's left hand, resting on the porch boards beside him, did something it had not done in 11 years of mornings, 11 years of coffee cups and clenched knuckles and a ridge of callus worn into his palm by a lead he no longer carried. It opened, not gradually, not through the long, deliberate finger-by-finger uncurling he'd trained himself into after every unconscious clench. It simply opened, all at once, fingers spreading flat against the wood, the tendons along the back of his hand going loose for what felt, to him, like the first time in over a decade. He hadn't decided to do it. He noticed it only after, the way he noticed most things about his own body now. A fact arriving late, without his permission asked. His palm lay open on the porch boards, and Dagger, without any command, without any three-word ritual phrase to invite him closer, pressed his head directly into that open hand and stayed there. Rowan sat very still, feeling the warmth of him, the steady rise and fall of breathing that had, at last, gone fully even, no catch left in it at all. Behind him, he heard Mara's breath catch, not fear this time, something else, something that sounded, if he had to guess, like a woman watching two broken things finish healing in real time. "He trusts you," Mara said quietly. "No," Rowan said, and his voice, for the first time in longer than he could remember, carried something unguarded in it. "We trust each other." Took a while to get the vocabulary right. His hand stayed open the rest of that afternoon. It stayed open through dinner, through the low murmur of Denny and the inspector finishing paperwork at the kitchen table, through the slow settling of an ordinary evening into an ordinary night, and later, lying in the dark with Dagger's weight pressed warm along his side, Rowan realized his hand had not curled once, not during the knock, not during the standoff, not during any of it. It had taken 11 years, and one scarred dog, and 11 days of quiet, deliberate work. But for the first time since a rooftop in a country he no longer named out loud, Rowan Voss fell asleep with both hands open. Word moved through a small county faster than any lean ever could. Within a week of Ashby's arrest, and the unraveling of Ridgeline Holdings that followed it, 6 other elderly landowners suddenly finding their stolen paperwork reversed, their names cleared, their land restored to them. Trucks began appearing on the gravel road out past Colton Ridge. Engines Rowan no longer needed Dagger to sort into threat or not threat, because he'd learned by then the particular unhurried rhythm of neighbors arriving to work rather than to take. Mara's grandfather's house had sat half-collapsed for years, roof sagging under a decade of unpaid repairs, and by the second Saturday, it had a new roofline entirely, framed and shingled by a dozen hands that asked for nothing beyond coffee and a place to eat lunch. Rowan couldn't see the work being done, but he could hear it in fragments all day long, hammers finding rhythm with each other, the particular satisfied grunt of men setting a beam level, laughter carrying across the yard in a way that felt, to him, like a sound he hadn't realized his own property had been missing. He spent those Saturdays mostly with Eli, the boy having attached himself early to both Rowan and Dagger with the uncomplicated loyalty children sometimes offer people the rest of the world has learned to overlook. It was on one of those afternoons, the two of them sitting on the porch steps while Dagger dozed in a stripe of sun nearby, that Rowan began teaching him something he'd only recently finished learning himself. "You want to talk to him right. You gotta stop using your mouth first," Rowan said, and heard Eli's small laugh of confusion beside him. "I'm serious. Watch his ears before you ever say a word. Forward and loose. He's curious, he's fine. Pinned back flat, you back off. Whatever you were about to do." He reached over, guided Eli's hand with his own, toward Dagger's shoulder. Slow, telegraphed, the same deliberate approach Rowan used for everything now. Never reach over the top of his head. Feels like a threat coming down on him, even from someone he trusts. Come in low, from the side. Let him see your hand the whole way. Eli tried it, hand trembling slightly with concentration, and Dagger's tail thumped once against the porch boards. An easy, unbothered sound that made the boy grin wide enough that Rowan could hear it in his voice. "He likes it. He likes that you asked first," Rowan said. "Most everybody forgets to ask first." It became, without either of them planning it, a kind of curriculum. Weeks of small lessons, Eli learning to read a huff from a growl, a stretch from a warning, the specific stillness that meant, "Give me space," against the different stillness that meant, "I trust you enough to stay." And in teaching it, piece by careful piece, Rowan found himself understanding something he hadn't fully articulated even to himself. That this, the patient, wordless work of teaching one wounded creature to trust another, was the first thing in 11 years that had felt like purpose rather than mere endurance. The idea arrived fully formed one evening in early autumn, while Rowan sat listening to Dagger's easy, even breathing beside him, and thought, for the first time in longer than he could measure, about the years still ahead of him, rather than only the years behind. He knew what it was to be discarded by a system that had used him up and moved on. He knew, now, in his hands and his ears if nowhere else, what it took to bring something broken slowly back to whole. There were other dogs like Dagger out there, washouts, retirees, animals labeled unfit and left behind by people who had never learned Eli's simple, patient lesson of asking first. By the time the first frost came, Rowan had converted the old tool shed, the same one that had held Dagger's fear in the dark for 3 days, all those months ago, into something new, a modest kennel, built to specification by hands that no longer needed to see a blueprint to follow one, meant to hold not cages but quiet and patience, and the same slow architecture of trust that had rebuilt one dog and, in rebuilding him, had quietly rebuilt a man too. The first new arrival came 2 weeks later, a shepherd mix, thin and flinching, surrendered by a shelter 2 counties over, that hadn't known what else to do with him. Rowan sat with the crate a long while before opening it, listening to the ragged, uneven breathing inside, and felt something settle into place that had been missing since a rooftop, since a hospital bed, since the day the world had first gone dark and silent around him. "Hey," he said quietly, to the animal he couldn't see. "I hear you. There is a particular kind of wisdom that only arrives to those who have lost the ability to look away from what truly matters, because looking was never the thing that mattered in the first place." Rowan Voss spent 11 years believing that the darkness which had taken his sight had also taken something else from him: the right to be needed, the right to be trusted, the right to matter to another living thing the way he had once mattered to men who depended on him to bring them home. He built a life around that belief without ever naming it as a belief, arranging his mornings into counted footsteps and measured drawers, mistaking discipline for peace, mistaking silence for healing. It took a wounded dog hiding in the dark of a tool shed to show him the difference. Loyalty, it turns out, was never a thing that required eyes to recognize. It lived instead in the register of a voice kept low and even through a stranger's fear. It lived in the patience to sit 12 paces back from a trembling animal until 12 paces became 6, became 1, became none at all. It lived in a hand kept open on porch boards, offered without any certainty it would be accepted, and in the quiet miracle of a scarred head choosing, of its own will, to lean into it anyway. None of that required sight. All of it required something harder to come by: the willingness to stay, past the point where staying was easy, until trust had nowhere left to go but toward you. And healing, real healing, was never about forgetting. Rowan never forgot the rooftop, never forgot the weight of what he carried out of that country and into a cabin at the end of a road nobody maintained anymore. Dagger never forgot the sound of metal against metal, never fully lost the specific catch in his breathing that marked where an old wound still lived beneath new fur. Their scars did not disappear because a good thing finally happened to them. They simply stopped being the only thing either of them carried. What changed, what actually changed in the end, was not the presence of pain, but the presence of company inside it. A man who flinched at silence found a creature who flinched at sound, and between the two of them, neither one had to carry the flinching alone anymore. That, perhaps, is the whole of what second chances ever really are. Not an erasure of what broke you, but the arrival of someone else who understands, without needing it explained, exactly what that particular kind of broken feels like, and chooses, regardless, to stay. Somewhere out past a gravel road that the county still refuses to maintain, a shepherd mix is learning, one careful day at a time, that a bowl set down 12 paces back is not a threat but an offering. A boy is learning to ask permission with his hands before he ever reaches out. And a man who once measured his entire world in exactly 40 steps between a bedroom and a kitchen has found, at last, something worth walking toward without needing to count the distance at all. The kindest thing anyone ever taught Rowan Voss was not spoken. It arrived on 4 legs, with a scar along its left side, and it asked for nothing but the simple, radical mercy of being heard.